want you to imagine that you walk into a cocktail party alone. There's lots of people here, all mingling in pairs or small groups. You spot a group of people that you recognize as sharing a common interest of yours. In fact, let's say they are acknowledged experts in this community, and you join their group. But this is no ordinary group. Everyone here is an acknowledged expert on this subject. Let's say it's Shakespeare. And they are in a deep discussion. You wedge yourself into the circle, and without waiting to hear exactly what they're saying, you interrupt the current speaker and launch into your pet theory. Well, I think that the works of Shakespeare might have been written by someone else. Imagine the reaction. Not only did you just rudely join a conversation without bothering to listen to the actual subject of discussion, but your pet theory is one that has been discussed to death in Shakespeare circles. It's hardly new or innovative. How likely is it that your ideas will make any contribution to the conversation, or that this group of people will want to include you in their future conversations on Shakespeare? You won't be going home with any phone numbers or social media contacts. You'll be seen as a total bore. Imagine instead that upon joining the group, you listen intently to what everyone has to say. The more you hear, the more you realize you don't know. So you seek out more perspectives, still listening. The ideas these other people are bringing up cause you to question and refine your own. And then, once you understand the various positions and debates, you weigh in with your own thoughts, building on the arguments already expressed and pointing out gaps in logic or a missed piece of evidence. How do you think your contribution will be received in this case? It's much more likely that the group will want to listen to you and take your ideas seriously, both now and in future gatherings. This is why the literature review matters when you're doing research. The lit review is where you dig deep into what scholars and other experts have already learned on your topic. This lets you build your own work on the back of what they have done. Remember our previous discussion about how science is cumulative? How are you supposed to add to that knowledge base without taking the time to learn what we already know? The literature review is where you do that. You find out what we know, and you build your work on top of it. This lets you add to the conversation with the assurance that you are making a genuine and valued contribution. So, don't be a cocktail party bore. Do the literature review. Now, most people, when they say that they want to do research, typically they think of going to the library or heading online and looking for sources and information. Actually, we gather information at least twice in any study. The second time is when we get our actual data, the statistics, surveys, experimental results, reports, or historical analysis that will let us assess our claims. It occurs much later in the process after we've designed our entire study. The first time is right now, when we review the scholarly literature on our question and find out what is already known on the subject. Let's define our terms. The literature is what we call the body of scholarly work on a given question or topic. It's a bit of an odd term. It's not really referring to novels or stories, so no Jane Austen or Toni Morrison here. Instead, we're talking about the work that scholars and scientists have completed and published in a particular area. So, you might review the collective work of literary scholars about Jane Austen. We'd call that the Austen literature. Or you might refer to the string theory literature in physics, or the deviant behavior literature in sociology, or the Tudor dynasty literature in history. A literature review, then, refers to both the process of finding and evaluating this body of work for your chosen topic or question, as well as the section of your report or presentation where you share your conclusions about the literature. So first, you find the literature, read it, and then draw conclusions about what we do and do not know. Later, you will produce a section of your report, written or oral, that explains the key claims of that literature, the themes, debates, gaps, methods, and overall conclusions drawn from this review of scholarly work. Now keep in mind, the literature review is not optional. Doing one is not simply about saving yourself from embarrassment. Consider it your entrance ticket to that cocktail party. After years of drop-ins derailing conversations, the organizers now require you to show your academic medal as the price of admission. Likewise, conducting a literature review and demonstrating you've done so by including it when you share your work, that's required to have your work taken seriously by a research community. No literature review, no grants, no publication, no accolades. Now, this can seem elitist. If your ideas are brilliant, why should you have to go through the effort to read the work of others? Well, even Newton and Galileo's work came about as a response to the work of their contemporaries. They knew what others were saying, and they challenged those ideas, and in so doing, changed the course of scientific history. We tend to venerate the individual in Western society, but that's not how scientific research works. You need to understand what ideas are out there and their strengths and flaws before you're able to really advance our understanding of the world. If you don't do the literature review, you don't even know whom you're challenging. That circle of scientists at our cocktail party might include Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, and Stephen Hawking. But because you haven't bothered to find out who else is working on the subject you care about, you don't even recognize them for who they are. How embarrassing for you. They will definitely be talking about you after that party's over, but not for the reasons you might want. Okay, hopefully I've convinced you now that there are a lot of negative consequences if you don't do the literature review. So let's talk about the positive side. Let's consider what kinds of things you might get out of doing a literature review. There are a number of practical things we can learn from reading the work of other scholars that will help us build our own study. You can learn where mistakes were made and identify best practices that will help you build your own research design. Specifically, you'll find common and accepted definitions for the concepts and variables you plan to use. You'll learn which concepts and variables are important in the first place. You will see what cases have been studied and which ones haven't, perhaps providing a clue for where you can make a contribution. You'll learn what kinds of qualitative or quantitative methods are generally employed to study this question and what sources of data are out there. You might even find an unanswered research question or untested hypothesis that you can tackle yourself. So many of the questions that you might have about designing your study can actually be answered in a thorough review of the literature. But wait, there's more. Reviewing the literature also helps us in bigger picture tasks too. Collectively, the literature is going to tell us about the state of theory and practice in this particular area. It can help us identify the debates that scholars have, the scope and limitations of existing theory, unexplored gaps of understanding, practical examples where policies and programs have or have not worked, and connections to other fields or areas of study. A thorough read of the literature is what starts many researchers on their projects. They see something that other scholars have missed, or a way to resolve an existing debate, and that's their point of entry into the discussion. Okay, now that we've learned about what to look for when we read through the literature, let's talk about how to identify and find the specific sources that you need. Scholarly sources are going to be the key to any literature review. A scholarly source is a book or journal article that is written by an expert, written for other scholars, and has undergone peer review. That is, other experts have evaluated that work and deemed it worthy of publication, usually in a double-blind process. That simply means that neither the author nor the reviewers know the identities of those involved. The goal is to ensure that the work is evaluated based purely on merit. Typically, we avoid non-scholarly sources in the literature. A non-scholarly source is a book, article, or other source that has not undergone scholarly peer review. Examples might be a newspaper article, a magazine, blog, social media post, or a self-published book. Even if the author is an expert, if the source isn't peer-reviewed, it's not typically considered a scholarly source. Some of these sources can still be useful, but they're only rarely considered part of the literature. So how do we identify a true scholarly source? Well, let's look at those 3 criteria I mentioned, but let's explore them in a little bit more detail. So first, scholarly sources are written by experts. So let's look at the author's credentials. The author will typically hold a terminal degree in the field. That's the ultimate degree that one can obtain, or they'll be in the process of acquiring one. The author also will usually have an affiliation with a university, think tank, or reputable research-based agency or organization. If you can't find any information about the author's credentials or they don't meet that level, it's probably not a scholarly source. Second, scholars write scholarly sources for other scholars. If the intended audience is the public, students, government officials, company executives, or friends and family members, it's usually not considered a scholarly source. This is pretty easy to identify. If there's a lot of indecipherable jargon and charts, few pictures, no colorful, glossy paper, and citations and footnotes galore, in other words, if it looks a bit imposing or downright impenetrable, congratulations, you've probably found a scholarly source. Now, this will vary by discipline. Over in art history, you will certainly find more color and photos. But generally, scholarly sources often have a high bar of entry for the average reader. A common critique lobbed at academics in the ivory tower is precisely aimed at this point, that they only talk to each other, and not the people who might be affected by or use their work. Whether you agree with that critique or not, for now, looking at evidence of the intended audience will help you identify what is generally considered a scholarly source. The final and most important criterion is that a scholarly source be peer-reviewed. A good way of determining whether this is the case is by examining the publisher. Is it a university press like Princeton, Oxford, or Stanford? That's usually a good sign. Likewise, an academic journal such as Chemical Reviews will conduct peer review of all submissions. If you review the publisher information, it should have a clear section that discusses its review process, so look for peer review. Keep in mind that all three criteria must be met for a source to be appropriate for the literature review. A textbook, for example, that's usually written by experts and it's often published by a prominent university press. But since the main audience is students, not scholars, textbooks are generally not considered scholarly. Apply the three criteria, you should be fine. Okay. Now that we know what to look for, we need to know where to look. One way to find the sources that you need is to find one or two highly relevant and recent journal articles on your topic. That's right, just one or two articles are really all you need. Remember when I said that scholarly articles are usually full of citations and footnotes? Well, why do the work of tracking down a ton of citations when other scholars have already done that work for you? Find one or two really good recent articles on your research question, and you've got the key to the core of the literature. Go to the bibliography, track down the articles you see there. Then do the same with those articles. Keep going and note which articles keep popping up in the bibliography. The ones that keep showing up, those are likely the core of the literature on the subject. Now, once you start doing a lot of research in a particular area, you'll get to know who the big names are and which articles or books are considered the most central to current debate. You might even meet the authors at a conference. But when you're just getting started in a new area of research, this snowball method of finding sources can be really useful. Another thing you can do is check the number of citations for a given article. Google Scholar will report that information if you do a search using the article's title. A high citation count means that article has been consistently cited by other scholars in their work. It's a good sign you've probably found a core part of the literature. Another option is to ask a mentor. Your mentor may already know the big names in this field and might be able to direct you to some of the core works that you need to know. Now, to find those one or two articles that I suggested in the first place, you have a couple of options. You can head to your local university library, if there's one near you, and browse the stacks of bound journals. Or if you go to the website for the professional association in your field, it should identify some of the top journals in your discipline. For example, the American Political Science Association publishes the American Political Science Review, a top journal in the field. You could pull out a recent edition and start browsing until you find a relevant article. Searching databases on the internet might be quicker though. Try a catch-all database like EBSCO, Academic Search Premier, or JSTOR. Enter in a few relevant search terms and narrow the responses to scholarly sources. You can use the provided subject headings in an article's description to further narrow your results. Now, that's all great with anyone that has access to a university library, but many people don't have that option. Still, you'll be able to find some sources available through free search databases like Google Scholar. There are also subscription services that let you rent journal access on a monthly basis, like DeepDive, or sites like academia.edu, which allow authors to upload their papers. Your public library may have some resources, and it's possible you may have alumni access privileges at an institution that you previously attended. Finally, some journals, particularly those in the natural sciences, have moved to open access formats, which allow free public access to their publications. Now that we have a pile of sources, let's talk about what to do with each of them. Journal articles can seem difficult to decipher at first, but they follow a fairly standard format once you know what to look for. Let's look at one and learn how to understand what we're reading. The journal Science published an article called "Protecting Unauthorized Immigrant Mothers Improves Their Children's Mental Health" on August 31st, 2017. The authors ask their research question in the first paragraph. They want to know the impact of a parent's unauthorized status on a child's well-being. The last sentence of their first paragraph begins the literature review section of the article, as the authors note that their study is filling a gap in existing literature. The lit review then continues for the next 3 paragraphs as the authors note relevant studies that connect parental immigration status to child development. And they note the methodological issues that have prevented a full understanding of this question. Then they outline the nature of their study, the subjects, sources of data, specific variables used, method of analysis, and then they turn to their results. They close with the implications of their results and possible steps for future research. It's important to take notes during this process so you can find your way back later to any sources you found and any important ideas that occurred to you along the way. So first, before you write down any source's research findings, note down its bibliographical information, as well as the page or paragraph number of any material that interests you. If you want to save yourself some time later, you can upload that information into a citation manager system. They're now included in many word processor programs. That will actually create a bibliography for you with a single click. But for now, just make sure you know exactly where each idea and finding came from so you don't have to go back and look it up again later. Next, for each article or book, take notes on its claims, research design, and implications. Note down exactly what the authors claim to contribute, as well as the details of the research methodology they use to evaluate those claims. Now, try to paraphrase whenever possible. As you read, you may question the process or results, particularly as you start going through multiple articles on the subject. Note down those issues too, and note any connections or contradictions to other articles that you've already read. At this stage, it's really important to clearly distinguish between what the authors are saying and what you think about what the authors are saying. I like to use a yellow highlighter for my own thoughts and put the word "me" at the start of any ideas I have. That makes it clear to me what is my original contribution, and it also prevents any accidental plagiarism. With our science article, you would note the full citation and then mark down the research question, the gap it claims to be filling, the methodology the authors use, and the key findings. If you have any questions, ideas, comments, or connections to note, you're going to put those in your notes as well, but use a different color or highlight them, bold them, whatever you like. Just make it clear that that's your analysis and commentary and not what's found in the article itself. Now, you're going to repeat this process with all of your sources. Depending on the size of your project, you may consult 15, 50, or 100 or even more sources. You want to be comprehensive, so use the sources you are reading as a guide. If they're citing an average of 25 sources, that's a good number to aim for. The final step, now that you've evaluated the individual sources, is to draw and eventually present your conclusions about the literature. Remember that the literature tells us about the state of knowledge on your chosen topic. So that means the point isn't simply to report that Scholar X said this and Scholar Y said that. A list of sources and their contributions and findings, or those notes we just took, we call that an annotated bibliography. This is a source-by-source list of the important characteristics and findings of each book or article. It's an initial first step to writing a literature review, but the literature review itself requires you to go further. So instead, you need to identify the core findings in the literature. This means you have to explain what's known about the answers to your research question. This might be consensus on a set of definitions, or a methodology that scholars tend to use to study this question, or agreement on which range of theories are most germane to the subject. But you also have to explain what's unknown. If we already know everything, there's no need for your project. So what specifically should you look for? Well, there are a lot of comparisons to make as you synthesize your sources and write your literature review. You might, for example, look for common themes across the sources that keep popping up. Or you might look for gaps, issues, or ideas that the authors seem to miss but that you think are really relevant and maybe worth exploring in your own project. Another way to organize your thoughts is to look for debates between authors. Where do they disagree? And is there room for you to enter the debate with your own contribution? Are there different theoretical perspectives that you encounter that are in contradiction to each other? If so, that might be a way to organize your review of the literature. One last thing to look for are methodological choices and debates. You might note that the dominant methodology used to study similar questions to yours is quantitative, which means that a qualitative approach might provide some new insights. What this means is that a literature review is not simply a paragraph about what each author has to say. Instead, you should focus your writing on one of those methods, using themes, gaps, debates, or methodology to organize your thoughts. You cite sources as a type of evidence supporting your argument that this theme, gap, debate, or methodology is a useful way of understanding the current scholarly approach to your topic. Let me illustrate this approach. Imagine we're doing a project on whether democracies are more peaceful than authoritarian regimes. After reading a bunch of sources, I determined that scholars generally disagree with this idea. Democracies are not more peaceful in general, they just tend not to fight other democracies. In my literature review, I may have a paragraph explaining that initial idea of the peaceful democracy, famously credited to Immanuel Kant, and follow it with a paragraph citing the scholars that disagree with that premise. Then I might turn to the different explanations for this democratic peace theory, the norms of democratic societies, the constraints of legislative activity, and the fact that war is just pretty rare in the first place. Then I might look at limits to the argument, the conditions when these explanations don't hold up. Or I might examine the methodologies most commonly used to study this question and try to define my terms as they're used in the literature. Finally, I might identify an existing gap that I intend to fill in this literature. So now it's your turn. Take a look at the notes you've written. Try to group sources together according to these themes, debates, gaps, methods, or issues that they discuss. Each section of the literature review should focus on exploring the nuances of these points, and you use those literature as your evidence. Make the authors talk to each other. It's almost like you're recording the conversation from our cocktail party earlier. It's not a transcript of each individual speaker, but a record of the conversation, out of which you are noting the most valuable collective points. Okay, so we just walked through the steps on how to conduct a literature review. Now that we've learned how to do one, let's make sure we really understand why going to all that trouble is an absolutely vital first step of our research. I'm going to give you some examples as to what can happen if you don't do a proper literature review. Here's the thing. At some point, research is going to require you to put in a lot of work. It has to happen on either the front end or the back end, and you are almost always better off by putting in the work early to ensure good results later. It's kind of like baking. Have you ever tried to make cookies or a cake? You know how the instructions tell you to properly grease the pan? Have you ever skipped that stage and just put the cake in the tin or the cookies on the sheet and thrown them in the oven? If you have, and I have, you know that when they come out, they still look great, right up until you try to get the cake out of the pan and it won't come out. Instead of a perfect looking cake, you'll get one with bits missing that you then need to fill in with frosting. Trust me, I once learned how to make chocolate ganache simply to cover a cake that had holes in it due to improper greasing technique. Now, if I had just gone to the trouble of properly greasing at the start, it would have saved me a lot of heartache later on. Now that I've made you hungry, let's get back to the literature review. It's the same thing. Doing the literature review upfront is going to save you a ton of time and frustration later on. So for example, say you want to do a survey of your community's perspective on a national issue, let's say healthcare policy, and you want to compare it to the national results. You could skip the lit review and come up with a series of questions yourself and send out your survey. But your questions will not adhere to the standard ones used in national surveys, and that means you can't actually compare your results. Your only options are to either throw out your results and start over, or give up the ability to really compare your results to those national numbers. If you had done the lit review first, you would have learned about those national standards, saving you the trouble of creating your own questions and ensuring you could compare your results. That extra work on the front end would have saved you a bunch of trouble. Here's another example. Let's say you want to study what kinds of government have been the most warlike since 1945. To do that, you're going to need a definition of whether or not a country has fought a war in a given year. Well, what counts as a war? World War I? The Korean War? The War on Terror? The War on Drugs? If you use the number of officially declared wars in the United States as your measure, you're quickly going to be in trouble. Only 5 wars in US history had official Senate declarations attached to them, and all of those occurred by 1942. There are plenty of other definitions that you might come up with, but here's the good news. International relations scholars have already debated this issue. One of the most commonly used data sets for the study of war, the Correlates of War Project, settled on a definition of war: sustained combat involving organized armed forces, resulting in a minimum of 1,000 battle-related fatalities within a 12-month period. Now, your entire study hinges on having a strong, accepted definition of war, and failing to use a conventional definition makes it less likely that your work will be accepted, much less published. Anyone familiar with the literature will reject your work because you didn't do your homework, sending you back to the drawing board. Now let's say you're a lawyer. If you're representing someone and you haven't done your literature review, which is reviewing the relevant case law, you are going to be killed in court. You might even be sued for malpractice. You need to know what opinions have been issued, keep up with changes in the law, and not make any assumptions that the law in one state is the same as in another. Lawyers are always under tremendous time pressure, but the good ones don't ever skip their literature reviews. Their careers depend on it. And lest you think I'm immune to this myself, think again. I already shared my mistake with the cake. That, at least, had a happy, chocolate-filled ending. But one time in graduate school, I cut corners in a presentation at a conference, and I didn't do a full literature review. I just charged ahead with my own ideas. Someone in the audience called me out on it, and they noted an important book that was incredibly relevant to my topic. It was mortifying, and I almost quit graduate school over it. But ultimately, it was helpful. It taught me the penalty of not putting in that work up front. Professional embarrassment. I backed up, I read the book, and you know what? My work ended up being a lot stronger. The novelist Brandon Sanderson, in his book, The Way of Kings, writes, quote, "Given 2 works of artistic majesty, otherwise weighted equally, we will give greater acclaim to the one who did it first. It doesn't matter what you create, it matters what you create before anyone else. The greatest talent we think a man can have, seems to me, it must be nothing more than novelty." End quote. Novelty is indeed prized, particularly in research, but to be novel You need to know what's original and what's derivative or repetitive. And the only way to do that is to figure out what's already been done. The Lit Review is your pathway to novelty and acclaim. If you want to be a great researcher, do your literature review.